So you want to own the Byzantine Empire. There is just one problem. Your first purchase is not a palace, a fleet, or a gold mine. It is the tax system. By the early 6th century, Constantinople was sitting on an imperial machine that could collect millions of gold solidi every year, move grain across major Mediterranean routes, mint its own currency, and turn taxes into armies, walls, churches, and political survival. The uncomfortable part is that the empire did not become rich because Byzantines invented modern capitalism. It became rich because the state was exceptionally good at making economic activity flow through institutions it could tax. So what exactly was the product? Who paid for the army? Why did a roughly 4.5-gram gold coin matter so much? And how did an empire with estimated state revenue of 11.3 million solidi, around 540, eventually shrink to a government whose last emperor reportedly owed Venice 17,163 hyperpyra in 1453? The answer is a 1,100-year business model built around land, taxation, trade, currency, and one extremely valuable asset: Constantinople. To enter this business in 518, you needed something modern entrepreneurs rarely possess: an imperial throne. Anastasius I had spent roughly 27 years rebuilding the fiscal machine before his death in 518, and his treasury reportedly contained about 23 million solidi, equivalent to roughly 144 tons of gold. That reserve was the empire's version of working capital. Justin I inherited it, and Justinian inherited the system in 527. At its estimated peak around 540, annual state revenue may have reached 11.3 million solidi, or about 50.9 tons of gold. Historians debate the exact totals, but the scale is clear. This was a government whose annual cash flow could be measured in tens of tons of precious metal. The state controlled coin production, collected land taxes from the provinces, drew revenue from imperial estates, and spent heavily in Constantinople on the court, army, administration, and construction. The faster route was conquest. Instead of waiting decades for taxable land to produce revenue, Justinian spent heavily to recover Roman territory. In 533, Belisarius invaded Vandal North Africa. In 535, Byzantine armies entered Italy. The campaigns created territory, taxpayers, ports, and strategic depth, but they also created a spectacular expense account. Justinian's wars, construction projects, and administration consumed resources at the same moment that disease and warfare began damaging parts of the tax base. It was an acquisition strategy with one obvious flaw: the new assets came with armies attached. Geography was the empire's unfair advantage. Constantinople had been made the imperial capital in 330 at a major intersection of east-west trade, and its position connected the Black Sea, Aegean, Balkans, Anatolia, and routes towards Syria and Egypt. A merchant could move goods through the capital and reach markets linking Europe, the Mediterranean, and Asia. Byzantine authorities levied customs duties, while silk, spices, incense, grain, and luxury textiles generated unusually high-value trade. When Egypt and Syria were lost during the 7th century Arab conquests, the empire lost more than territory. It lost major agricultural and commercial engines that had supplied both revenue and food. Here is the strange statistic. Byzantine economic history is often described as agricultural, but the state was also one of the largest economic actors in the system. It controlled coinage, and the gold solidus, later called the nomisma, remained remarkably stable for centuries. A coin containing roughly 4.5 grams of gold could cross borders because merchants trusted the imperial standard. In a world where bad coinage could destroy confidence, monetary credibility was itself an economic asset. The stability depended on the state's ability to collect taxes, pay soldiers, regulate markets, and defend the routes that made the coin useful. And then came the risk nobody could insure against: plague. The disease reached the Byzantine Empire in 541 and Constantinople in 542. Procopius claimed that the capital sometimes lost 10,000 people per day, although modern historians regard that figure as exaggerated, and estimates are often closer to 5,000 daily deaths during the worst phase. The broader demographic and economic impact remains debated. Research using Egyptian papyri has even challenged the idea of an immediate collapse there. But the fiscal mechanism is simple. Fewer workers can mean fewer crops, fewer taxpayers, and fewer soldiers. In March 542, Justinian issued legislation designed to protect banking and debt claims, as the disease disrupted normal economic life. The empire was trying to keep its financial machinery operating, while mortality was attacking the people inside it. So why run this system? Because the real business was not collecting taxes, it was converting economic activity into state power. A farmer produced grain, a landowner produced rent, a merchant moved silk, a workshop produced cloth, and the government extracted resources through taxation, customs, regulated markets, and imperial estates. Then the state recycled those resources into soldiers, ships, roads, walls, courts, and administration. The army protected the tax base. The tax base funded the army. That circular relationship was the Byzantine economic engine. Take a simple example. Imagine a provincial farmer whose taxable output is worth 100 solidi. If the state ultimately extracts 10 solidi through land taxation and related charges, those 10 can become military pay, administrative salaries, or purchases from private suppliers. The soldier spends his pay on food, clothing, transport, and services. The merchant receives the coin and may pay another tax. One gold coin can therefore circulate through several transactions before ending up in a hoard, church treasury, private purse, or another tax payment. The empire did not need every transaction to belong to the government. It needed enough economic activity to remain taxable. At imperial scale, the numbers become enormous. Around 540, estimated annual state revenue of 11.3 million solidi represented about 50.9 tons of gold. Even if the estimate is off by millions of coins, the principle survives. The government was monetizing a huge taxable economy. By 555, estimates fall towards 6 million solidi, showing how quickly war, disease, and territorial change could alter fiscal capacity. The business worked only when the productive provinces remained connected to Constantinople. The second revenue stream was trade. Constantinople was not merely a capital. It was a gigantic demand center. The imperial court, aristocratic households, churches, monasteries, soldiers, and urban population needed food, clothing, fuel, metal, animals, and luxury goods. Silk was especially valuable. In 553 to 554, domestic Byzantine silk production began after silkworm eggs were introduced during Justinian's reign, traditionally associated with monks who smuggled them from the east. That changed the economics of silk because Byzantium could capture more of the value chain instead of relying entirely on imported raw material. State-sponsored workshops and later private workshops helped turn silk into one of the empire's signature industries. The first dark case is Justinian himself. Between 527 and 565, he spent enormous resources on reconquest, administration, and construction. Hagia Sophia was completed in 537 after roughly 5 years of construction, following the destruction of the previous church during the Nika Revolt of 532. Justinian also patronized more than 30 churches in Constantinople and commissioned construction across imperial territory. The buildings were not merely religious projects. They demonstrated that imperial taxation could be converted into stone, marble, labor, and political legitimacy. But the same reign also contained wars, plague from 541 onward, and mounting fiscal pressure. The lesson was not that spending was irrational, it was that an empire could look financially unstoppable shortly before its productive base became harder to maintain. The second case is the monetary crisis of the 11th century. For centuries, the gold numisma had been one of the most trusted currencies in the medieval Mediterranean. Then its gold content was repeatedly reduced during the 11th century. By the reign of Michael VII from 1071 to 1078, the monetary system had suffered serious deterioration. Confidence weakened because the government was forcing the currency to carry a larger fiscal burden while reducing its precious metal content. In 1081, Alexios I Komnenos inherited an empire facing military pressure, fiscal weakness, and monetary disorder. His 1092 monetary reform introduced the hyperpyron and restored greater credibility to the gold standard. It was essentially a financial reset after decades of spending monetary credibility. The third case is the endgame. The Fourth Crusade captured Constantinople in 1204, fracturing Byzantine political and economic power. The Byzantines recovered the capital in 1261 under Michael Vs Palaiologos, but rebuilding was expensive. The territorial base continued shrinking, and Genoese and Venetian merchants increasingly dominated profitable trade routes. Constantinople, which had once been the leading commercial center in Europe, was losing economic weight to Italian competitors. By 1453, the contrast was almost absurd. The remaining Byzantine state was financially tiny compared with its former scale, while the Genoese quarter of Galata had become a powerful commercial enclave. On 29 May 1453, Constantinople fell to Mehmed II. Constantine XI died during the final defense, and according to surviving economic estimates, he owed Venice 17,163 hyperpyra. The empire that had once generated an estimated 11.3 million solidi in annual state revenue, around 540, had become a government whose fiscal capacity could no longer match the cost of defending its capital. That is a roughly 900-year journey from tens of tons of annual gold revenue to a city struggling to finance its final war. There are 3 lessons in that collapse. First, revenue is only useful when the territory producing it can be defended. Second, a strong currency is an asset, built over generations, and can be damaged far faster than it can be rebuilt. Third, trade privileges can solve a short-term military or financial problem while creating a long-term strategic problem. Byzantium repeatedly exchanged pieces of future economic control for immediate relief. That is not uniquely medieval. It is one of the oldest refinancing strategies on Earth. The final surprise is that the biggest threat was not always an invading army. It was the shrinking tax base underneath the army. Lose Egypt and Syria, and you lose agricultural production, trade routes, and major sources of imperial revenue. Lose Anatolia, and you lose farmland, soldiers, and strategic depth. Give foreign merchants increasingly favorable commercial privileges, and you reduce the share of trade captured by domestic institutions. Debase the currency, and you reduce trust. Each problem makes the next one more expensive. That is how a fiscal machine can enter a negative feedback loop without a single bankruptcy announcement. Put it all together, and the Byzantine Empire looks less like a medieval kingdom and more like a 1,100-year state-controlled economic platform. Its core assets were productive land, Constantinople's location, a trusted gold currency, regulated commerce, imperial estates, and a tax bureaucracy capable of moving resources toward the center. Its core liabilities were armies, fortifications, court expenses, subsidies, wars, and the constant cost of keeping hostile neighbors from converting the tax base into their own revenue. The empire survived when revenue grew faster than those liabilities. It weakened when liabilities grew faster than the taxable economy. If you could somehow recreate the system at its 6th century scale, the small version would be a regional Byzantine-style state controlling several million solidi of annual fiscal revenue, enough to sustain a professional military and administrative apparatus, but not enough to dominate the Mediterranean. The large version would resemble the imperial machine around 540, with estimated annual revenue near 11.3 million solidi and roughly 50.9 tons of gold flowing through the fiscal system. Converting that into modern dollars would create false precision because one Byzantine solidus had no fixed modern purchasing power equivalent. The more honest calculation is physical. 11.3 million coins at roughly 4.5 grams each equals about 50.9 tons of gold. That is the scale of the cash engine at one of Byzantium's strongest fiscal moments. And there is the final irony. The Byzantine Empire survived for roughly 1,100 years, because it was exceptionally good at turning taxes into time. It bought another army, another wall, another treaty, another year. Eventually, the empire ran out of one thing even gold could not purchase: another century.